The aspirant must arrive at the understanding that it is not to have had the grace and privilege of hearing this inner mystical sound. What is more important afterwards is how he listens to it, with what aim and what spiritual value he attaches to it for his salvation. The adept will be very much helped in all this if he observes how his interest changes all the time. He will see it continuously falter, weaken, and alter its course with the slightest association of thoughts that arise in his mind. The aspirant's interest has to be constantly renewed and redirected onto its intended track and main spiritual objective each time it deviates from them. And this must apply to whatever other forms of yoga the aspirant practices and whatever other means of support he uses for his attention during meditation. How the attention is directed to and poised on this sacred inner sound, and with what determination it is held there both in duration and depth, will determine the degree of the inner spiritual freedom and spiritual light the adept will experience during and after his meditation. And the appearance and experiencing of this spiritual light, as well as the exalted feeling which will follow from it, will act as a benign token, enheartening him to make yet further efforts to remain connected to this luminous aspect of his nature. The aspirant has to teach himself to be always in a state of alert watchfulness. At any moment, robbers of all sorts can enter the doorways of his being and steal away his attention if he is not sufficiently on his guard. Then this unusual expanse of pure consciousness in him will become adulterated again and recede once more into the background. If a man is not wary enough, all the pleasurable or painful impressions he receives from the outside world, and especially how he receives these impressions, can often enmesh him and stick to him, leaving in him, long afterwards, inner disorders, confused thoughts, and troubled feelings difficult to disentangle himself from. The aspirant must learn to become very discriminating in what he allows to enter into the gates of his being. If he is advanced enough on this spiritual path, and if he is sufficiently enlightened, he will see how impartial and unaffected he can be by certain outer impressions, and how much protection he can also benefit from by remaining ever attentive to the mysterious song of this sacred nada. Apart from his concentration on it when meditating in the seclusion of his home, by constantly seeking to hear this mystical sound in active life as well, he will gradually learn to be more distant and free from the aspect of himself which is open to temptation and vulnerable to the unprofitable outside influences which make him forget himself. As he becomes more aware of himself and more experienced, this sound will permit him to see more rapidly when his attention is being solicited and about to be taken away from him again. It will also help him to observe how his attention is being enticed by these marauders disguised as friends. If one could see these seducers as they really are, in their true form, there would be no problem. The trouble is that they never come openly in their real guise, but always as seemingly pleasant friends and benefactors offering dreams of future delights, most of which are in reality unattainable, or instant pleasures which could ultimately greatly hinder the aspirant's spiritual evolution. Anything that entices, claims, and in the end totally absorbs and ensnares a man's attention is his real and only enemy. And each time he forgets his supreme inner Lord and falls asleep in himself again, he commits without realizing it the most serious sin there is against his own being. At such moments, it can truly be said that the fall of man is nothing more nor less than this curious forgetting of himself. That is to say, the forgetting of his higher nature and the awareness of his existence. It is in this state of self-forgetfulness that all wrong actions are performed in life. With the aid of this mystical sound, the aspirant will have a better chance of remaining vigilant and connected to his inner source, abiding for longer and longer periods in a state of self-recollectedness. He will ultimately come to see for himself that he is conscious of his existence solely during moments of self-remembering. The rest of the time, when he is in his habitual state of oblivion, he feels his existence little, and according to the degree to which he is absent, may even have no awareness of it at all. Through all this work, the aspirant, if he is sincere and serious enough, will one day suddenly discover that without his having known it before, he is all the time living on many different planes simultaneously, and that whatever he thinks or does on a certain plane instantaneously colors and affects all the other planes for better or for worse. When, during moments of profound self-remembering, the adept is intensely touched by feelings belonging to the domain of the sublime, they will pervade and light up all the different planes of himself, from the inside towards all the outer layers of his nature, in a manner which a man cannot conceive if he has not yet experienced the remarkable spiritual elevation which being present to the higher aspect of oneself confers. If the seeker can have the strength not to give in to any bad or unprofitable external influence and impression, not allowing them to enter and color his being, then it will be his innermost nature which will shine forth its effulgent light towards the outside of himself and fill him with its radiance. Nada Yoga, Yoga of the Inner Sound, Part 5. This will inevitably involve the continuous renunciation of one's habitual state of being, with all its ever-changing cravings, daydreamings, and useless fancies. The aspirant will then be confronted with the vital problem of having at all moments voluntarily to agree to forego or die to a certain aspect of himself, at least in some measure to start with, so that something higher in him can come to the foreground of his being and occupy its place. He will clearly see how hard this renunciation is. For various reasons, he may not be able to keep up such an intense and prolonged effort. He will probably in time tire of doing it and unknowingly slide backwards little by little, settling once more into his old habitual state of being. Without perhaps realizing it, he will then start to sleep inwardly again, thinking that he is still working by being merely satisfied with the intellectual knowledge and memory of certain limited spiritual experiences he may have had in the past. If, after long, arduous, and sustained efforts, a man has arrived at some degree of spiritual awakening and is not heedful enough of this particular kind of pitfall, then, owing to the self-complacency and pride which may surreptitiously install themselves in him through the little knowledge he has gleaned, making it more dangerous for him and everybody else than if he had not known anything at all on such a weighty subject, he will fritter away his further spiritual possibilities and life. Later, if by chance he realizes what has happened, it will be much more difficult for him to start making fresh efforts of such magnitude again. There can be no compromise in this matter. Either the man's attention is consciously absorbed in seeking to live in the higher aspect of his being, which demands a certain continual sacrifice of his ordinary self, using this sacred sound as a temporary support for that, or he lives blindly, his attention being constantly taken by his lower nature and wasted in worthless preoccupations which require no effort whatsoever from him, gravity being always happy to drag him down to the inferior levels of his being. The living flame of a lamp can only continue to burn and shine forth its radiance if there is an incessant sacrifice of the wick and oil in the lamp. The aspirant who has embarked on this difficult spiritual journey must realize as quickly as possible, so as not merely to grope his way about, struggling without right comprehension, that his attention is the cardinal element which goes to animate and nourish either the one or the other aspect of his being, rendering its manifestation possible. While striving to remain inwardly attentive to this mystical sound, if the adept has been favored with true spiritual awakening, he will be very much helped to see, without any mistake, how at every moment of his life, the two aspects of his nature are both calling to him to follow them at the same time. In the past, he simply obeyed the dictates of his ordinary self unquestioningly, and by so doing, he has unknowingly made himself what he is today. But now he is faced with the personal responsibility of an imperative choice to have to make constantly. The choice between the side of his nature he is to give himself to and uninterruptedly sustain with his attention so as to permit this ineffable flame to continue to shine in his being, and the aspect of himself he must perpetually sacrifice so that the higher can affirm its existence in him. It is a cosmic law that the two cannot coexist simultaneously, in the same way that it is not possible to put pure water in a jar already filled with crude earth without emptying and cleaning it beforehand. When a man lives through the ordinary aspect of himself, this inner mystical sound will not be audible to him. The more a man sinks to the lower planes of his nature, passively letting his interest and attention become involved with its incessant inner clamors and preoccupations, the more this nada will recede into the background of his being, until it is not heard any further. If the adept has been privileged enough to hear and recognize this sacred sound, he must then make every possible effort to try to remain in contact with it at all moments. He may one day discover that he can even be aware of its presence during sleep. This primordial sound is there in him, and in all things at all times. In certain mystical states, one can hear it vibrating mysteriously in the cosmos and in all the heavenly stars, just as it is also vibrating in the sun in a most spectacular way. The adept must later endeavor to hear this inner sound in very noisy places. He must choose the busiest streets and strive to hear this sacred nada with the utmost of his might until the day he arrives at doing so. He will thereafter be surprised to find that no matter how loud the uproar thunders around him, it is perfectly possible for him to hear this mystical sound vibrating in him with such clarity that there is absolutely nothing external that can drown it. When the aspirant is able to hear it in such conditions, he must then struggle to hold on to it in the most difficult situations possible without losing it. In the beginning, as he tries to hear it while walking outside, he should continually aim from one tree or object to another from the corner of his eyes, using the distance between them as a temporary support to remain aware of himself, all the time carefully listening inwardly to this sacred sound. This inner nada will become his most precious ally and alarm signal, warning him when he begins to falter and forget himself again. In that manner, he will begin to be protected from harmful identification with external conditions and the many pernicious influences of the outside world. When the adept succeeds in holding on to this sacred sound in such difficult conditions without losing it, a moment will finally arrive when he will become strangely distant from himself, and he will start viewing everything around him from another perspective altogether. He will feel that his vision seems to have inexplicably receded to the outside top part of the back of his head, from where he silently and impartially begins to witness all that is taking place around him. Everything will then be seen to be in a constant state of flux. From this uninvolved position, he will perceive that there is absolutely nothing permanent in any animate or inanimate object that meets his gaze. The whole panorama of outer existence will appear to unfurl in front of him as a sort of strange and fantastic dream. And behind it all, he will mysteriously see through his mind's eye, so to speak, the unity of all things, that which is pervading him and everything else at the same time. The adept should never forget the significance and value of this mystical sound. It must be looked upon as a benign friend and salutary aid, always there behind the turmoils of his never-ending outer problems and worries, ever knocking at his door to awaken him and help him remember himself. But people are generally too preoccupied to hear its sublime call or pay attention to it when it becomes manifest in them. External matters and their physical needs, as well as all their inner anxieties and incessant imaginings, take up the whole of their attention. It is as if something in them said, "Later, later, I must first finish what I am doing." But later never comes. There is always something else claiming one's attention, and another precious opportunity is lost. One must learn to be always ready and available to the higher calling of this ineffable aspect of one's nature, so as to render one's spiritual growth and unfolding possible before it is too late, earthly existence being so uncertain. If the aspirant is really serious in his spiritual practice and has had the rare privilege to have heard this wondrous mystical sound, has recognized it and is deeply moved by it, appreciating and venerating its presence in him, the latter will of itself commence to appear to him suddenly at most unexpected moments of the day. Like a divine emissary, it will knock at the gate of his soul, calling him to himself. How he greets this inner call at that particular moment is of paramount importance for him, for the manner in which he welcomes it will determine the frequency of the future visits of this heavenly messenger. The aspirant's inner response to its calling must always be, "Yes, and 1,000 times yes to thee." Each time it is there, singing in his ears, the adept's attitude to it should be that of a profoundly devout servant, ever ready to answer the call of his supreme Lord and King. At such moments, he must be fully aware with the utmost of his sincerity that it is here again, singing inside my ears, calling me. This mystical sound is truly like a hook of grace. It is the hook of grace of a divine fisherman trying to drag man out of the dark quagmire in which he is sadly entrapped. The aspirant will abruptly become aware of its presence in him at odd moments of the day, permitting him to see more clearly into what unhappy state he had been engulfed a moment before, and to what higher aspect of his nature he is called to turn once more. As his inner awareness deepens, the strange song of this mystical sound will grow correspondingly louder and more shrill in his ears. It will sing inside his head with such supernal beauty as to make him intoxicated with its celestial wine. In that way, it will also encourage and sustain him in moments when suffering cannot be avoided in this form of existence. It will, at all times, help to draw him away from his habitual little self and assist him in his efforts to climb out of the mud and unhappy state into which he has sunk, and to raise him to the ever higher realms of his supreme being.